Okay, thank you very much, Rob, for that wonderful introduction. That was very good, and I'm not sure I'm quite befitting of it, but who knows. I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, and also for those that have come a long distance, as I know some of you have. Thank you very much for coming, and I do really appreciate that. What I've got for you tonight is it's the first time I've put this together, so things I've become aware of basically over the last few years in researching the topics that Rob mentioned. Did tend to come across a lot of other things. So what we're going to attempt to look at is what I term a general health cover-up, which has been in operation for about 100 years, perhaps even longer, some would argue. We're going to look at programs and substances designed to deliberately harm health, such as most or all vaccinations. I've got something on that. AIDS and cancer we're going to look at, which have been talked about a lot in health circles, obviously. We're going to look at, in particular, at the 2009 swine flu scam. This is where I did actually write some letters and try and get involved and see what came out, and I got some interesting answers from the Department of Health. So these are actually quotes from the letters that I received in response to 17 questions, and all these letters and responses are posted on the website, so you can go and look at those in full if you wish. We're going to look at some cheap, effective treatments and cures for cancer. We're going to look at effective dietary treatment for diabetes. There's a slight typo there. We're going to look at energy medicine techniques, such as those developed by Royal Rife. And we're going to look at other forms of healing, such as matrix energetics. But really, there's going to be a lot of information in this, and it really sort of reflects what I've touched on. And I'm not a doctor. My background is actually in software engineering, as perhaps some people some people here already know from what I've said before. What I do at the moment, it's kind of derived from what I did in software engineering to earn my living, is I assess disabled students. That's the work that I do for the Open University. I do what's called DSA assessment work. And within that work, I do come across people who've got fibromyalgia, osteoarthritis and that sort of thing. So although I'm not a doctor, I have become aware of various medical conditions. I even saw somebody once who was HIV positive. So I do come in contact with these people, albeit very briefly, and I don't have to sort of get involved with any difficult problems really. So all I'm recommending essentially is things like ergonomic equipment and computers. So what I'm presenting is this information. It's because I've just come across it in looking at, as I say, at the other topics. So really, you have to do your own research, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few people in this room who are much more knowledgeable about maybe even all of this than I am. I'm just presenting you with a sort of a scrapbook, if you will, of what I've found, and I've put together some video clips, some audio clips, as I've done with the other presentations, similar sort of format really. And that, that's really all that I've done. I don't consider myself to have done anything other than that. I've just collected the information and tried to make it accessible. Just a note about the table there. I've got some DVDs and booklets on various subjects. I've got one called The Cancer Business, which is a recommended read done by somebody that I know. I didn't write that booklet, so you can come and get copies of that for 30p, or just take them and pass them on to people. So do come and have a look at the discs and DVDs and whatnot, and take what you will. So we'll start really with something which I'm sure everyone's heard of, which was AIDS. And what I discovered quite recently is its relationship to chronic fatigue syndrome, which I thought was quite interesting. And what I've got here initially is Dr. Boyd Graves. In fact, I think he was given an honorary doctorship by some researcher. He wasn't actually a doctor. He was a graduate of Annapolis Law School. Boyd Graves contracted AIDS and then did some research into the origin of the disease, and he eventually ended up filing a lawsuit because of this piece of paper here. International AIDS activist Boyd Ed Graves, JD, will refile, this is from a press release, refile Freedom of Information lawsuit against the United States for full disclosure of the formerly secret US Special Virus Program from 1962 to 1978, And according to medical experts, any review of this formerly secret federal virus development programme will solve and end HIV and AIDS. As I say, he was a graduate of law school, so that's how he sort of got into the legal side of it, presumably. When he did his research, what Graves found was this special virus cancer programme, and he found that something like AIDS appeared to have been developed as part of the DoD's special virus programme. In other words, they wanted to develop a virus which fitted the description of AIDS. And this is shown in a flowchart which was part of documentation about this programme that he found in the, I can't remember, in the National Archives or some other documentation. So what I'm going to do is try and play a clip of him actually describing this, and I'll just hope this doesn't come out too loud, so I might have to adjust the volume.
Well, you know, 9 years ago I took an HIV test and learned I was HIV positive. And 9 years later I am still researching this issue. I can say, though, when I first began, I didn't know which direction this entire issue would go. But now, 9 years later, we have some pretty firm information as to the origin of this pandemic. And I think you are aware that we have a government flowchart document that has passed scientific and medical muster with respect to its authenticity as being the quintessential missing link document in establishing the true laboratory birth of HIV.
Well, that's a pretty major discovery to lay on the table for people, and I understand this is quite recent. Can you give us a little bit of description as to what is actually in this?
Yes, the flowchart is the research logic of the U.S. Special Virus Program. The U.S. Special Virus Program began officially in 1962, and it persisted for the next 15 years or so until about 1978-79. But during that time period, each and every experiment conducted under this program went towards the development of HIV. And by that I mean we have the yearly progress reports of this federal program that shows that this federal program is indeed the birthplace of HIV. In fact, we also have the budget for this federal program. From 1964 through 1978, the U.S. Special Virus Program spent $550 million to make HIV and other chronic illnesses.
So that was just an introduction to, you know, that whole broadcast is much longer, and he goes into much more detail about how he discovered this. And I didn't hear this particular broadcast. That, I think, was made in about year 2002, 2003. I forget the exact year when he made that broadcast. And I'd already heard this from Leonard Horowitz, something similar. So when you get two people saying the same thing, you start to think, oh, maybe there's something in this. And actually what he also found was this amazing thing. An AIDS cure was actually patented. I won't read all of this out, but United States Patent 5,676,977, Antleman, October 14, 1997. Method of curing AIDS with tetrasilver tetroxide molecular crystal devices. Now this was actually taken directly from the US Patent Office website. I've just copied the page onto this PowerPoint slide. And what struck me was this use of crystal tetrasilver tetroxide. Anyone heard of colloidal silver? Yeah. So, I mean, you know, again, I don't know all the details. I'm sort of skipping around and just putting out bits of information here. But that's what really, I'm not going to read it all out, but that's just to show you the actual patent. You can go and look at it. So somebody has already patented a cure for AIDS in 1997. What's going on? Just a bit more about Dr. Graves, because he received Tetrasil, and in 2001 he became the first American and African American to receive an injection of Tetrasil, which was what you just saw the patent for. He became an outspoken... Graves' health began recovering from years of damage inflicted by a special HIV virus, and he became an outspoken proponent of the Tetrasil treatment, demanding immediate clinical trials and worldwide accessibility for people living with HIV and dying of AIDS. Soon afterwards, Tetrasil was recalled by the patent owner manufacturer Dr. Marvin Antleman and Antleman Technologies without public explanation. Graves took his experiences and requests to Congress, General Accounting Office and the Centers for Disease Control, United Nations, World Health Organization and several ministers of health around the world with varying degrees of success. and several African countries where he was widely revered and respected as the man who sold AIDS. But Graves died in 2009, only last year. And I tried to find the cause of death, but I couldn't find one, so I don't know what he died of. So, another person who's, after the truth was gone. Now, another person that I came across some time ago was this chap, and he sounds like a really nice guy, very knowledgeable guy, Donald Scott. He talks about AIDS and mycoplasma and things in this clip that I've got. He's found the Common Cause Foundation in Ontario, and he earned a BA from the University of Toronto in 1952, MSc, taught at high school and university levels, and elected to a teacher's pension plan committee. He retired in the 1990s. In 1995, he began to full-time study of scientific basis of the neurosystemic degenerative diseases. These are sort of whole body diseases. In collaboration with William Scott, he wrote the extremely unfortunate Skull Valley incident in 1996, I think that's a misprint on the website, and the brucellosis triangle. He discovered a link between AIDS and mycoplasma while trying to help someone suffering from the chronic fatigue syndrome, and this was clips from about 2004, so you can hear what he's got to say, and he says sort of pretty similar things.
The United States, at the end of World War II, took the senior Japanese researcher and biological weapons researcher, Dr. General Ishii Shiro of the Japanese Imperial Army, and they recruited him to work for the Americans. Here was the leader of Japanese imperial biological research who had killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Allied prisoners of war, being employed by the United States government. And I also learned that they did the same thing in Germany in spades. They sent over certain qualified people to interview German researchers who had been conducting biological research on prisoners in Auschwitz and other places. And of these gangsters that had been testing terrible weapons on innocent victims, they recruited about 900 of them. And some of them they put into American Army uniforms and flew them back to the United States and put them to work. There was, for example, a guy they called the Butcher of Bucharest. Now, he was a Nazi who was in charge of the Gestapo's prison camps for Jews in Bucharest. This man had committed terrible atrocities. He was hired by the United States government, and under various kinds of disguises and aliases and all the rest of it, he was never unemployed for the rest of his life. He was not prosecuted for his war crimes. He was put to work helping the United States especially. Now, I say especially because the United States was not alone. Canada had their part in it. South Africa had their part. Israel had their part. But especially the United States, they went to work to develop two kinds of biological weapons. One kind of biological weapon would be lethal. It would be a weapon which in their own literature they describe as refractory to the human immune system. And the other weapon was to be disabling. It was refractory to the human immune system but would not kill the victim. And we learned that the lethal weapon was what we now know of as the cofactors that cause AIDS. And the disabling weapon was the disease biological agent that causes, among other things, chronic fatigue syndrome, and is a cofactor a cofactor with the Visa virus that causes AIDS. Now, why did the United States and its allies want two types of biological weapon? The real truth is this, and I have evidence in spades. The truth is this: they knew that they could disperse the cofactors that present as AIDS among the black and brown people of the third world, and they could kill 8,000 people a day, as they're doing this very day, and as they did yesterday, and as they'll do again tomorrow.
So he's basically saying there that AIDS was released into the black community, into black communities in Africa, and again I've got another clip about that shortly from somebody else. And it was actually the way they seem to have done it was through vaccines. This is the way they seem to have done it. And it seemed to have happened with the hepatitis B vaccine in the 70s. That seems to be how they did it. Now, this is where we get onto Leonard Horowitz, who I've listened to for a few years. And he's a Harvard graduate, and he was originally a dentist, he probably still is, I don't think he practices anymore. And he was asked to look into issues of hygiene related to treating dental patients with AIDS. So, you know, we had all that scare with the, you know, getting blood on shared medical tools and this sort of thing, and toothbrushes and all this. And that's what he was asked to look into for the Dental Practitioners Board or whatever, you know, in the States. I can't remember the exact details. And he discovered some odd things about AIDS, and I think he seemed to have followed a similar path to both Boyd Graves and Donald Scott. And I've got a clip from him here. Again, I'm using a lot of clips. But this is from him from a video from the 1990s. I don't know exactly when this was filmed, but I think it was in the early 90s.
This is taken from the American Journal of Public Health, 1988. It's just one little piece, but there are lots of other examples I could give you. In the short time that we have, I'm just going to give you a couple. This is lifetime needle sharing experience in HIV antibody seroprevalence. That is, this is the behavior in the blue that causes the percentage of the behavior that allegedly causes the transmission of the AIDS virus. That is needle sharing, where bloody needles, contaminated needles are shared among IV drug users. And that's the risk, we're told. And then in the red, you see that's the HIV positive percentage of these IV drug users who are HIV positive. Now, you see that, for example, in San Antonio, 99% of the IV drug users share their needles, share their works. In other words, they're the dumbest IV drug users in the country. Versus the smartest IV drug users in the country are in New York. But look at the difference. Where you have 2% seroprevalence rate in San Antonio, in New York you have 61%. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to conclude that something bizarre happened in New York. Likewise, Tampa, 72% seroprevalence, 0 seroprevalence rate, and 72% share needles. If you look at AIDS diagnosis by half years, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City, again, you compare San Francisco is in the black, Los Angeles is in the white, and New York City is in the purple. Again, you see it is far and beyond the epidemic's prevalence is in New York. And it should have kind of like leveled off a little bit. Something bizarre happened in New York. Well, what could that be? Well, here you see in black. This is actually from the National Cancer Institute and the International Association for Research in Cancer. Their publication, this is 1974 National Cancer Institute monograph, where they show you a map of what they were doing and where they were doing it. And you see very clearly what they're studying: liver cancer viruses, hepatitis B viruses, they believe to cause liver cancer, in New York and in Central Africa, in fact, northwest Uganda. So that's how, in my opinion, based on the evidence, the AIDS virus got out. They used those people and those contaminated serum to produce the first phase 1, phase 2 studies for lots of experimental hepatitis B vaccine containing 200,000 human doses that they used in 1974 simultaneously in New York City and Central Africa. That explains really almost everything. Although you might have a question, well, weren't there AIDS cases before 1968? No, there were not. Despite the disinformation that you have heard, all of the cases prior to 1976 have been refuted in the scientific literature. The problem is it never made it to the front page of the newspapers like the initial finding, which was disinformation. In fact, the world's leading molecular epidemiologist and genetic evolutionist, his name is Gerald Myers at Los Alamos Laboratories, published in Jay Levy's book called The Retroviridae, which is the definitive text in retrovirology. 1995 publication says that the only isolate, the earliest isolate that we have of HIV-1 is a 1976 strain. Nothing earlier has been found.
So basically he's saying that all the evidence points to the AIDS virus being released in the hepatitis B vaccine. You know, and again, there's a lot more on that you can read up on if you wish. So now, staying on the theme of vaccines, we're going to move on to this fellow, you know, for no particular reason, and it's to do with vaccines, and he's British. This isn't particularly to do with AIDS. But Dr. Andrew Wakefield, probably quite a few people in the room have heard of. He's I don't know what all these initials stands for, but he's basically a fellow of the Royal Society of Pathologists. He's a gastroenterologist into sort of stomach and bowels and sorting those out, particularly in children. Medical degree from St Mary's Hospital, 1981. This is just from his own website. Gastrointestinal surgery with a particular interest in inflammatory bowel disease. That's how he got into all of this. Qualified as a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1985, so he's, you know, up the ranks up there. 1996 was awarded, now this is interesting, that's why I highlighted it, Wellcome Trust Travelling Fellowship, working for Glaxo Wellcome, to study small intestinal transplantation in Toronto, Canada. He was made a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists in 2001. 130 scientific paper, articles, books, chapters, and invited, blah, blah, blah. In the pursuit of possible links between childhood vaccines and intestinal inflammation and neurologic injury in children, Dr. Wakefield lost his job in the Department of Medicine at London's Royal Free Hospital. He lost his country, his career, and his medical licence. And I've got a clip of him from quite recently of putting this together, and he was actually on Coast to Coast just a few weeks ago, 9th of June, talking about another vaccine which had to be withdrawn. So this is from his own research about another vaccine which had to be withdrawn. And this gives you a snapshot of what goes on with just about all of these vaccinations.
Now, you, as you were doing your work, you had an opportunity to talk with a government whistleblower. His name was George as well. And what did he tell you? What were his revelations?
Yes, his code name was George, and George was brought across from Canada in 1987 to advise the British government on the introduction of MMR, where they'd already introduced it in Canada. Canada had introduced a vaccine called Trivirix, which had to be withdrawn very early on because it caused meningitis. It was unsafe. That same vaccine was rebranded, just given a new name, the exact same vaccine called Plusrix, and licensed in the UK in the same month that it was withdrawn in Canada. And this was an extraordinary situation. The British government or the regulatory authorities in the UK were aware that it had been withdrawn in Canada because it was dangerous, and yet they introduced it in the UK. And that is a measure of how much I think they care about the issue of safety. And George had advised them not to introduce it because of the problems, and they ignored him. And over the next 4 years, there were repeated problems with the vaccine, with increasing numbers of cases of meningitis in the UK. These were ignored, they were dismissed, and finally, a small amount of money was put into a study in the university in Nottingham in England, which showed beyond doubt the rate of meningitis with this vaccine was very much higher than had previously been thought. The vaccine was withdrawn overnight, and the vaccine, sadly, not taken off the market, but then shipped out to developing countries where it has also caused epidemics of meningitis. So a very questionable ethical and moral practice, the British government introducing a vaccine that was knowingly unsafe. And the rub to this, the real problem underlying this, is that when I got involved in this, there was a legal action by parents against the manufacturers, and they thought, and I thought, and the lawyers thought it was against the manufacturers, but it wasn't. As it turns out, and as George disclosed to me, the government had underwritten the liability of the company because the company, SmithKline Beecham, had said, we don't want to introduce this vaccine because it's unsafe.
Oh,
I think
my
that
gosh.
it's extraordinary situation.
So the government underwrote the company for the vaccine. We'll come back to that point in relation to something else later. And I've also got another video. This is just a general video about doctors speaking out against vaccines. This is in relation to the swine flu vaccine last year, which again we'll come back to in relation to the letters I wrote.
Every vaccine carries a risk of injury, and that risk can be greater for some than others.
American parents would make very different decisions about how they vaccinate their children were they given the proper information.
One of the reasons that I'm here is the toxicity of vaccinations as they have been used for such a long time in this country.
It's not in the best interest of your children. You're going to be trading some innocent types of diseases that we now know how to handle better for other problems such as allergies, asthma, even autism for years to come.
I began looking at vaccine toxicity years before I had my first child back in the 70s. And back then there was enough information for us to see that the whole theory of vaccines could be terribly flawed, and that by dumping stuff into the blood could in fact cause some severe long-term illnesses.
So the current climate of vaccine science is very controversial. The information that we're being given, that I was taught in medical school, is not consistent with safety and efficacy. As we see the number of vaccines being added to the schedule, we're also seeing a tremendous increase in the number of chronic illnesses in children.
My concerns are the absence of any adequate safety studies looking at the long-term detrimental effects of vaccines used in childhood, and the almost cavalier continuance of the process of introducing more untested vaccines into a schedule of vaccination that is already appalling in terms of its scientific underpinnings.
The swine flu vaccine contains squalene. It's in one of the European versions. It's being tested on 4 continents. This particular oil, when injected into animals, causes crippling disease. Wouldn't you like to know that before somebody said, I'd like to put this in the veins of your son or your daughter?
I strongly advise against getting the H1N1 flu vaccine. It is not a very serious illness. The swine flu vaccine has both aluminum and mercury in it, which are both neurotoxins. Squalene may be added. Squalene is an adjuvant that stimulates your immune system to attack itself. It has been associated with Gulf War syndrome in 2 papers.
This public readiness and emergency preparedness waiver was issued for all the H1N1 vaccines to be used in the United States, including any novel adjuvants if they are used. These waivers have also been issued for pandemic influenza vaccines of a number of types. What that means is that if you are injured from one of these H1N1 vaccines or another pandemic vaccine, you have no access to the legal system.
At this point, it's become very clear that the government is engaging in a deliberate practice of censoring science, of suppressing science, with simple changes in the vaccine schedule, such as delaying vaccines, getting out the metals such as aluminum and mercury, separating the shots, that they can reduce the amount of adverse events. This is the mandate of Congress in 1986 when the Congress passed a law with a mandate for safer childhood vaccines. This has never been carried out because the government officials are simply afraid of the results. At this point, it's gone beyond regulatory misconduct, I think, to criminal negligence, because the government, it is incumbent on the government to release this information, to fund these kind of studies on an ongoing basis, so that we will have the information we can to change the schedule and to give parents the proper informed consent.
It is not a very serious illness. It's less bad than our seasonal flu. Please do take your vitamin D, your vitamin C, eat healthy, eat organic, get lots of sleep, drink lots of water. That's much safer than taking the vaccine.
You have the human right to make an informed voluntary decision whenever you're going to take a medical risk that could hurt you or your child.
If we're going to look at food, if we're going to look at the plastics in the environment, the heavy metals, the pollutants, the perfumes, the skincare products, antibiotics, we must be open to the possibility that not only is it the vaccination itself, the introduction of materials that are foreign to the body past the natural immune system, but we also must entertain the possibility that some of the byproducts of vaccine manufacturing also make it into the body and destroy or impair or contribute to the destruction or impairment of our children's systems.
Really do your research and know that, number one, you have a right to make this decision. No government should ever force us. And please don't make this decision based out of fear.
That's a little bit out of date, that last section, because the flu myth thing has kind of disappeared now. Before we go on to something else, I want to look at another story linking, and I don't know, again, heard of this quite recently, cancer, viruses, vaccines, a monkey, and something else. This is a very interesting story that I came across, and it was actually in an interview with this fellow, Ed Haslam. Now, he was born in Kansas 1951. His father was appointed to a teaching position at Tulane Medical School, which is New Orleans, and as a child he got to know one of his father's colleagues, Mary Sherman. Ed Haslam was educated in New Orleans. Teachers, classmates and friends and family members were involved in the investigation carried out by Jim Garrison. Kennedy assassination. As Haslam himself points out, this gave him an insider perspective of these events. In 1990, Haslam began to investigate the death of Mary Sherman because he knew her and her relationship with David Ferrie, if anyone remembers that name. In July 1995, he published Mary Ferrie and the Monkey Virus, and in 2007 he published Dr. Mary's Monkey. And in this book, he looks at the connections between Mary Sherman, Alton Ochsner, Patrick Dre Frawley, I don't know all of these names, Ed Butler, David Ferrie, Guy Bannister, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This is a very interesting story. I've got a very short video clip, but I'm going to play a short audio clip again as well of Ed Haslam to tell you what he knows, or some of what he knows.
When Mary Sherman was murdered, it was a kind of a big event in my family because she was one of my father's best friends. And the fact that it was a front-page murder for 2 weeks in New Orleans, a very bizarre mystery that nobody seemed to be able to figure out.
And tell us, Ed, a little bit about this murder, if you would.
Well, there's like two sides to the coin. There's what the public was told and what I found out really happened.
Tell us what the public was told first.
Okay. The public was told that an intruder went into Mary Sherman's apartment, stabbed her to death, and set her on fire. And her body was found naked in the smoldering apartment, and they went around looking for a psychopathic sex slasher. And that was the public story, and everybody kind of wanted to take 2 steps back and say, "Oh yeah, I met her once, but I didn't really know her," that kind of stuff. And 30 years or so, about 28 years after her murder, which was in 1964, I actually got her autopsy report and police report out of the public library, and they had been locked in the chief of police desk in the intervening 28 years.
In his desk?
In his desk, yeah. And in fact, at one point, I asked a guy who was a professional murder investigator for Orleans Parish. I mean, that was his job. He worked for the DA's office.
Yeah.
I asked him if he could get me a copy of the police report on that. He said, "Yeah, sure, no problem. I do it all the time. I'll get it for you in 48 hours. And when I called him back in 48 hours, he said, "What did you get me into?" He said, I almost got fired over this, and I've been answering questions, and when I tell them some teenage kid asked me to get this, they all laugh at me. He said, "What is going on with this murder?" And when I finally, nobody knew was the problem. When I finally got a hold of the autopsy report, I discovered that, yes, Mary Sherman had been stabbed, but there's a lot of situational stuff here. The real issue was that her entire right arm and right rib cage had been disintegrated by heat. Now, she's in a wood frame building. There's curtains next to her bed that didn't catch on fire. There's a paper label on the sherry bottle that didn't catch on fire. There's human hair next to this carbonized burn, and you can see into her body and see her organs. I mean, this is all in the official documents, and this is what was not told to the press. I mean, this is like saying, forgetting to tell the press that Nicole Simpson's throat got cut. It's the major fact in the case.
Now, was anybody ever arrested or convicted?
No.
Okay.
No, the police stood up and said, well, this is one we're not going to be able to solve, so everybody back to work, Let's start with the what disintegrated the arm issue.
Okay.
Because the only way you can do that is like with millions of volts of electricity. I mean, we're talking about a lightning strike here. It doesn't even do damage like that. So we're talking about something that's, I'm going to call an industrial accident for the moment, involving a massively powerful piece of electronic equipment that Mary obviously had access to, and she obviously grabbed something with her right hand, and it blew out her arm like it was a spark plug or a fuse.
Okay.
And when I discussed this with doctors, and I've had a lot of people help me with this on the way, and one of these doctors had a lot of experience with high voltage burns, and he said, Ed, what I can't figure out reading this autopsy report is why her feet didn't come off. I mean, normally the electricity goes to the ground. He said, here, her arm is gone, but her feet are fine. So what's going on? Well, it took me years to sort all this out, but we finally found the building that the equipment was in, and it had a steel wall in it. Why did it have a steel wall in it? To protect the operators from the radiation. They had a 5 million volt linear particle accelerator hidden in uptown New Orleans on U.S. government property, and this metal wall had a cable attaching it to the ground so that electrons and stuff would be routed to the ground, and she was standing in front of the wall when she grabbed the circuit breaker switch, and somebody, in my opinion, booby-trapped that facility. Now, when did this happen? Why did they booby-trap it? Let's look at this. The date is July 21st, 1964.
Okay, so it's after the Kennedy assassination.
Right, but it's the day the Warren Commission starts their investigation in New Orleans.
This is interesting.
All this back to a doctor to review, then they take it all back to the U.S. Public Health Service for another round of radiation that ratchets up the lethality of the virus.
More.
So what they were basically doing is they had a particle accelerator in New Orleans at Tulane University, and they were using it to actually make the cancer-causing effects of a virus more powerful. They were doing this in secret experiments, and Mary Sherman was involved in it. maybe she was about to whistleblow on this operation. And I do have another clip. I thought it was in that one, but it's basically the link to David Ferrie was involved with Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was involved with the Kennedy assassination, as is revealed in the Oliver Stone film. Basically, they found a treatise in David Ferrie's belongings when he was, after he was killed, about this cancer-causing virus. There's a whole paper about that. I've just got another clip in relation to Lee Harvey Oswald and the doctor who was at the university.
Level of connection between Dr. Alton Ochsner and Lee Harvey Oswald. And I say that completely confidently because right here we have a record album which was produced and released by Dr. Alton Ochsner concerning the radio debates involving Lee Harvey Oswald. And on the back of this record album is a photograph of Dr. Alton Ochsner where it points out that he was one of the few people in the listening audience who knew about, quote, Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union before the debate. Now I want to ask the question directly. This man was the president of the American Cancer Society. What is the president of the American Cancer Society doing getting tangled up with Lee Harvey Oswald? I think the answer involves cancer.
So what I'm trying to establish is this pattern of vaccines and viruses all being interrelated and one being used to disseminate the other. And I think, again, we've seen this happen with the swine flu vaccine. We've got to ask ourselves what was really in that. Now, I became very interested in this because I knew that this was a scam from the offset. So what I'm going to go through is the evidence as to why this was a total scam, this thing. The scare seemed to start with the reports of an outbreak in Mexico on the 17th of April 2009. You might remember that, so just over a year ago. Health bodies claimed this was expected, but they don't really give a good reason why, and I'll go into that in a little more detail shortly. The curious thing was that some people pointed out, I certainly wasn't the first to point this out, that this supposed swine flu outbreak was just slightly less than 3 years since the bird flu, which you remember in George Bush's regime scare, and it had been hyped up. It never got very serious in Europe or the USA anyway. And also you remember that SARS failed to become anything. That was going to kill us all, and then there was about 10 cases or something, and that was that. But what I found out is, again, some of this stuff was sent to me, some of it I stumbled across myself. Almost 1 month before the outbreak, on 19th of March 2009, Medical News Today, which is a website, reported that a French pharmaceutical company called Sanofi-Aventis invests 100 million euros in a new facility in Mexico to produce seasonal and pandemic influenza vaccine. This is 1 month before that outbreak was reported. And on the 6th of April 2009, my friend sent me this, 11 days before the first Mexico case appeared, Derby Telegraph, my local paper, held an article entitled "Flu Pandemic Could Kill Up to 1 in 80." And the Derby Telegraph article discusses the stockpiling of surgical masks and gowns, and the paper stated they were working on guidelines and information provided by the health authority. In other words, we wrote to them, where did you get this information? Why are you talking about a flu pandemic, 11 days before the actual Mexico swine flu thing came out? How have they got this information? They said they got the information from health bodies. So was the virus engineered? Was this, again, we've looked at how the AIDS virus seems to have been engineered in the special virus program. I know I've covered that very sketchily, but you can go and look at all the further evidence with people like Leonard Horowitz and Ed Graves' website. But according to the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, they were sort of even disclosing that this thing seemed to be man-made, and this was on the radio as well. People said this on the TV. The so-called swine flu infecting and killing human beings in Mexico and North America this spring and summer is a new subtype of AH1N1, not previously detected in swine flu or humans. This is the key phrase. This novel H1N1 influenza swine flu virus is a triple recombinant, including gene segments of human, swine and avian origin. This is what the experts were saying. It actually had 3 different types of species, gene segments in it. And that's where I got that information from, the National Council of State Legislatures. Some would say this was only possible if the virus had been genetically manipulated in a lab. How can you get birds and pigs and humans to interbreed? You can't do it unless you're doing it in the laboratory. Alexander S. Jones, not the Alex Jones who runs InfoWars, this is somebody else, former employee of the US National Institutes of Health, the NIH, has analysed the genome sequence of the virus. Blast sequence homology of swine flu indicates both the hemagglutinin, all this techie stuff, surface protein, as well as the non-structural NS1 interferon inhibition proteins are novel recombinants previously unidentified in nature. Both these influenza proteins, based on the genetic sequences released Friday, May 1st by the US Centers of Disease Control, CDC, share their closest genetic identity with turkey, avian and pig swine strains from multiple continents, including North America as well as Asia. Even the closest matches indicate 5% previously unidentified genetic material. He concluded, we must seriously consider a laboratory origin for this virus. Somebody put this virus together in a lab. That's what it looked like. And again, that's came from Jane Burgermeister's website at the time. It's been reproduced elsewhere, I think. So people are saying actually openly that this thing was engineered in a lab, the swine flu vaccine. And the other thing was that the Baxter sent bird flu virus to European labs by error. And they said live, it was actually live virus. And Bloomberg reported this on the 24th of February. Baxter International Incorporated, this is the pharmaceutical company who produced the vaccine, or one of them that did, unintentionally contaminated samples with the bird flu virus that were used in laboratories in 3 neighbouring countries, raising concern about the potential spread of the deadly disease. And contamination was discovered when ferrets at a laboratory in Czech Republic died after being inoculated with vaccine made from the samples early this month. The material came from Deerfield, Illinois-based Baxter, which reported the incident to the Austrian Ministry of Health. Sigrid Rosenberger, a ministry spokeswoman, said today in a telephone interview. So we've already got some evidence that they were deliberately shipping contaminated samples into the system. And then we hear the story of Jane Burgermeister. I'm sure there'll be quite a few people in this room are familiar with her story. She was a journalist, basically. I won't read all this out. And what she did was she came across some of the information I'm telling you about the shipping of the contaminated vaccine and this sort of thing. And she decided to file charges against World Health Organization and Baxter Pharmaceuticals. And then there was another incident that she came across of an exploding swine flu vials meant for a research lab on a busy intercity train in Switzerland. So there was this incident apparently where the train was, had to be, and it wasn't even decontaminated. They just went in and sort of helped everyone out, and they didn't decontaminate it or anything. Further evidence points to the work of an international crime syndicate. This is according to Jane Burgermeister, which is what it looks like. The apparent motivation being the huge financial rewards through the mass vaccinations of the population with the vaccines that the criminal elite create to fight the pandemic which they created. Well, to make the millions, they don't even need to vaccinate people, because now they've got, however many million unused doses of vaccine in this country, but the pharmaceutical companies have still been paid, so they don't even need to vaccinate people. Let's see, questioning the information that we were given us about swine flu. This is what I did from the offset, really. I managed to bring myself to read the leaflet that came through the door. I'm sure this was delivered to all households in the UK. God knows how much it cost them. But to my knowledge, this has never been done for a vaccination before in the history of this country. They've never had a national leafleting campaign for a vaccine. And when I work mainly at home and I go out and see people, but I do go down to the Open University at Milton Keynes occasionally. I went down there when this was about, and they had leaflets up on the walls, where you make your tea and coffee. All these leaflets everywhere. And I'm thinking, oh my God, And I noticed that this actually contains false information, this leaflet. It contains false information because it says no one will have immunity to the virus. No one, specifically no one, will have an immunity to the virus. But it's my understanding that there is always a natural immunity to just about everything in some people. And also it depends on your state of health and stuff like that. So that's an immediate scare. That's, it's just scare tactics coming through your door. False information. And I picked them up on this. Oh, remember this? I came across this a few days ago. That was another. I only know 3 national leafleting campaigns in the UK in my lifetime that I remember. There may have been others, but this was one. And the other one was the Protect and Survive leaflet about nuclear war, thinking about 1984 or something. That came through everyone's door. Now, there's a little story about this, because the time this came through our doors, I had a friend, he did biochemistry when we were at university, and he ended up testing blood samples in a laboratory. He said it was really boring. And we were sort of joking with him. He said, you've been testing AIDS, potentially AIDS samples, and he said, yeah, we've had some of those through. And we said to him, well, do you think, you might have contracted AIDS? And he says, no, I've got ignorance. As in, don't die of ignorance. So, that made us laugh. Now, is or was the swine flu even a real risk? To me, if you look at, in fact, several people did this. They had a cold, and they rang up the swine flu helpline, and they said, oh yeah, you've got swine flu. But they didn't have swine flu, they just had a cold, because the symptoms were exactly the same. And you get somebody on, and they set, again, they set up a special phone line, as you probably remember, a special phone line for you to ring up. And some people, and apparently you could ring this phone line up, and they'd send you Tamiflu pills through the post. This is the first time that I've ever known the patient-GP relationship to be broken, so that somebody just sends you the pills through the post. What the hell is going on? And many media reports hyped up what's happened, and then they often didn't name people. There's got these unnamed experts saying it's going to be the worst pandemic we've ever seen. That was repeatedly said. We've covered some of this. Are the treatment and vaccine safe? What about the treatment? Tamiflu. Tamiflu only treats the symptoms. It does not get rid of the virus. That was the first thing. It doesn't actually affect the virus at all. It just affects the symptoms. And in 2005, CNN ran a story, Rumsfeld's growing stake in Tamiflu. Rumsfeld, of course, is the former US Defence Secretary, who also was involved in getting aspartame approved, as you probably know. So it's all the same people. Comes back to the same people. And researchers have also noted that the shelf life of Tamiflu, one of the so-called treatments for those who have supposedly succumbed to the avian flu virus, is 3 years. The time between the avian flu scare and the swine flu scare. Obviously just a coincidence. I mean, again, a similar thing. This isn't swine flu, obviously, but the other thing that you've probably become aware of is this Gardasil. And it was reported in the Daily Telegraph 2008. I think that date's right. Sounds a bit old, but maybe it isn't. GlaxoSmithKline executive resigns as Ofsted advisor. A senior pharmaceutical executive has been forced to resign his position as an advisor to the schools inspectorate just 1 month after he was appointed because of the alleged potential conflicts of interest in testing and use of drugs on children. Now, I heard stories about the Gardasil vaccine, and there was, I forget who told me this, but it was basically, there was a class of girls, and the teacher was singling out those who hadn't had the Gardasil, what's the other name for it, Penny? The Hepa. What's the other name for the Gardasil vaccine? Is it Hepa? I forget the name of it. But it's for cervical cancer anyway. That's what the vaccine is supposedly against. And then once they got that underway in the media, they started trying to market it for boys for testicular cancer. Same vaccine. And going back to Tamiflu, as Penny was saying, tragic side effects such as hallucinations, delusional behaviour. So if you take the Tamiflu, this is what you get: loss of contact with reality, convulsions, nausea, vomiting, psychosis, suicidal behaviour, death of both adults and children. And some of those seem to have been, they really were reported in the media quite a lot as well. So they were reporting both. I'll come to what I mean on this, you'll see this. Right, so, yeah, the other thing that happened, when I was investigating into this and writing some of these letters, which I'll come to in a minute, what happened was a doctor of psychology contacted me, and he was based near Gatwick in London, and he said, I'm contacting you because I've become very concerned about the swine flu vaccine that's going around. He says, I'm being asked to make a list of vulnerable patients that should be vaccinated first. Now, he was a doctor of psychiatry, and a lot of the patients that he was treating, you know, they didn't know what day of the week it was. They'd forgotten their own name. You know, and if he was to ask them, are you allergic to egg protein, or are you allergic to gelatin, they would have no clue. They wouldn't know what he was talking about. Yet he was being asked to draw up a list for them to be recommended to them to be vaccinated. So he was, you know, he thought this was totally unethical. And he told me stories that had nurses rolling up in his practice with a trolley, saying, "Roll your sleeve up, just have the swine flu vaccine." You know, literally just rolling up, and he was saying to them, "Where's all the information?" "Oh, we haven't got any to give out." And they were just like catching people as they were going in and out the door. So he'd never, you know, heard that before. It was incredible. And these are some of the why I've got this list was this doctor. He essentially risked disciplining because he sent me internal NHS documents, which this table was within it, which lists the contents of the vaccine. And he sent me the actual list. So I've got the NHS-headed document which lists the contents of both the vaccines, the Baxter and the Glaxo one. Yeah, I won't read all that out because we've talked about the safety of vaccines. But this doctor says, vaccines are used to test biological weapons. I found that vaccines are used to spread diseases. They're used for targeted genocides. Vaccines contain other toxic substances injected directly into your veins, so you don't have your stomach lining to protect you, you don't have your mucous membranes to protect you, you don't have any protection, just goes straight into your bloodstream, and whatever's in there, that's straight into your system. So your immune system, if it's still working, has got to work much, much harder to fight it off. And they've even got, you know, it does list, it's got thimerosal in the vaccine, which is a mercury derivative as well. Let's see. Yeah, so let's just have a little clip of Dr. Carley. She was very active on the swine flu vaccine and other vaccines. She trained as a surgeon, and her son was inoculated and ended up brain damaged. Dr. Carley had her son taken away from her by the courts due to her fight to expose the damage done by vaccines. So her son was actually taken into care because of her fight against the pharmaceutical companies. Here I've got an edited extract again from City Talk FM, which was on 27th of July 2009. And the thing to listen out for in this is the doctor defending vaccination admits injection of mercury for treatment of syphilis was bad medicine. Yet they're still doing it. And he actually admits it. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long, this. I think we'll have a break up shortly after this.
You were trained, weren't you, as a general surgeon? And when did you change your style of?
When did I step out of the box? 12 years ago, my only child was brain damaged from inoculations, and that's when I started to investigate what the real deal is as far as vaccinations. And to make a long story short, I developed a protocol using natural therapies to reverse vaccine-induced diseases, which include all autoimmune disease, non-traumatic seizures, cancer, and genetic damage in people and in pets. And I am, as far as I know, the only court-qualified expert in vaccine-induced diseases. And I testify on a regular basis in court for individuals who have been vaccine damaged.
Dr. Carley, Dr. Aaron Ghosh here. I think the medical world does realise that it makes mistakes. I think Pete will tell us himself through his own personal experience that he's been treated maybe in certain ways for certain conditions that are now probably would look back and say are absolutely horrific. We used to use treatments all the time that we now know have probably been the worst things. That, for example, our treatments of syphilis, when we used to inject them with mercury, actually killed more people than the condition did. So we've known that we've always made mistakes. I don't think any of the doctors should be or are arrogant enough to think that they always get it right every time. But to say that we're hiding it now and we're too embarrassed to go back seems a little bit far-fetched to me.
You just said how they were treating syphilis with mercury and killing people. So then why are they still putting mercury in vaccines? Why are they putting formaldehyde and all kinds of things, aborted baby parts, animal parts? They're actually creating chimeras, animal-human hybrids, because there's no way to get the tissue culture out of the vaccine you inject into people. And in fact, there's been all kinds of studies The polio vaccine had this SV40 virus in it that was found to cause all kinds of cancers. And the researcher who discovered that was fired from her job, and they kept on using it for another 15 years. So I tell people, don't believe anything I say, check it out for yourself.
So, I mean, again, she's saying check this all out for yourself. Do your due diligence is the phrase that she uses. Yeah, quick look at a couple of other things before we have a break. Swine flu, look back in history. Spanish flu, 1918. Chapter 2, the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 was caused by vaccinations. All the doctors and the people who were living at the time of the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic say it was the most terrible disease the world has ever had. Strong men, hale and hearty, one day would be dead the next. The disease had the characteristics of the Black Death, added to typhoid, diphtheria, pneumonia, smallpox, paralysis, and all the diseases the people had been vaccinated with immediately following World War I. Practically the entire population had been injected, seeded with a dozen or more diseases or toxic serums. When all those doctor-made diseases started breaking out all at once, it was tragic. The pandemic dragged on for 2 years, kept alive with the addition of more poison drugs administered by the doctors who tried to suppress the symptoms. As far as I could find out, the flu hit only the vaccinated. Those who had refused the shots escaped the flu. My family had refused all the vaccinations, so we remained well all the time. We knew from the health teachings of Graham, Trail Tilden and others that people cannot contaminate the body with poisons without causing disease. So that's from way back. Also this, killer flu recreated in the lab. This kind of goes back to what they were doing with AIDS. Some experts believe a flu pandemic is overdue. Scientists have shown that tiny changes to the modern flu virus could render them as deadly as the 1918 strain, which killed millions. And they tried to recreate it in a lab. Why do that? What's the point of doing that? Yeah, I'll just play one of these clips, actually. I don't think we need the 1976 swine flu propaganda. I mean, it was terrible. You can get this clip on YouTube, but what I'll just show you next is a clip with Mary Tyler Moore, because it was stated by American officials that Mary Tyler Moore had taken the 1976 swine flu vaccination. She didn't.
As part of informing Americans about the swine flu threat, Dr. Sensor's CDC also helped create the advertising to get the public to take the shot.
Let me read to you from one of your own agency's memos planning the campaign to urge Americans to take the shot. The swine flu vaccine has been taken by many important persons, he wrote. Example, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, Elton John, Muhammad Ali, Mary Tyler Moore, Rudolph Nureyev, Walter Cronkite, Ralph Nader, Edward Kennedy, etc., etc. True?
I'm not familiar with that particular piece of paper, but I do know that at least of that group, President Ford did take the vaccination.
Did you talk to these people beforehand to find out if they planned to take the shot?
I did not know.
Did anybody?
I do not know.
Did you get permission to use their names in your campaign?
I do not know.
Mary, did you take a swine flu shot?
No, I did not.
Did you give them permission to use your name saying that you had or were going to?
Absolutely not. Never did.
Did you ask your own doctor about taking the swine flu shot?
Yes, and at the time he thought it might be a good idea. But I resisted it because I was leery of having the symptoms that sometimes go with that kind of inoculation.
So you didn't?
No, I didn't.
Have you spoken to your doctor since?
Yes.
And?
He's delighted that I didn't take that shot.
You're in charge. Somebody's in charge.
There are...
This is your advertising strategy that I have a copy of here.
Who's it signed by?
This one is unsigned. But you'll acknowledge that it was your baby, so to speak.
It could have been from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It could be from CDC. I don't know. I'll be happy to take responsibility for it. So,
I mean, again, they're trying to, rope people into it. There's another clip here, but it's just so bad. I'm not sure I can play it. It's just so blatantly obvious, this propaganda. Yeah, so what I did was, I'll just go through this quickly. I wrote to the Department of Health. I wrote to Derbyshire Health Authority, where I live, also known as Derbyshire Primary Care Trust. I sent them a list of 17 questions, and these, again, this is all on my website, as I mentioned. And they responded on the 19th of August. And for additional answers, they suggested that I contact the Department of Health, DOH or DH. I wrote to the Department of Health on the 24th of August 2009. Let's see. Yeah, they weren't aware of, Derbyshire weren't aware of Jane Burgermeister's case. The Department of Health were. And I asked Derbyshire Health Authority, can you state clearly why swine flu is being perceived as so threatening when so far no symptoms other than those normal flu seem to have been reported? The UK has been preparing for a possible flu pandemic for the last 3 to 4 years. This has been on the basis that historical patterns of infection have suggested that a pandemic would emerge in this generation. These preparations were predicted on the potential threat posed by the avian flu type H5N1 virus. The avian flu threat never materialised. So they're basing their swine flu projections on something that never materialised. And that's from the Derbyshire Primary Care Trust. What efforts will be undertaken to inform the public of the serious side effects reported by some of those who took Tamiflu and Relenza? We have no specific plans to inform the public of the side effects of any individual medication. This information is readily available for patients in consultation with their GP and is contained as part of the general information leaflets contained within all medications. Yeah, fair enough. And I said, are you concerned that there is inaccurate and alarmist information in the leaflet distributed to millions of UK homes? It said, no one is immune from swine flu. General fitness and good health does not provide immunity to new infections, but may promote a faster recovery period. I disagree with that. Influenza type H1N is a new strain of flu which people in younger age groups will not have experienced previously and will therefore not have immunity. But the leaflet said no one would be immune, not young people. Good health and diet promotes a good immune response. Department of Health had received a copy of Jane Burgermeister's documents at the time I wrote. Department of Health says swine flu poses a threat because it is a new type of virus that few, if any people, have full resistance to. In most cases, the virus has proved relatively mild, as you suggest. However, around the world, thousands of people have died, and it is not yet clear how big the risk the virus is. For this reason, and because all viruses can mutate to become more potent, scientists are advising a cautious approach. No referenced evidence was provided as to why a pandemic was imminent. They didn't give me any studies, any medical documents, nothing. No documentation whatsoever was referenced to me for my question to be answered. They just said, this is what we think. This was the big one, and it comes back to what we said earlier. I asked which companies were producing the vaccine. They replied, the government has contracts with 2 companies to produce supply the swine flu vaccine. They are Baxter Healthcare Limited and GlaxoSmithKline. And this is the killer. This is where they really put the nail in their own coffin, if you ask me. Are the drug companies in the UK immune, no pun intended, from prosecution by those people that experience any serious or debilitating side effects after having the vaccine, as happened in 1976? They replied, the government signed the advance purchase agreements for the vaccines in June 2007. And that's in a letter from the Department of Health, and accepted liability for their safety as a contingency. I mean, I just about fell off my chair when I read that. All governments signing up to an advance purchase agreement were expected to provide an indemnity for the vaccine. And neither manufacturer would sign the contracts without it. That's from the Department of Health. And I just put a little footnote there. Of course, it's ludicrous to go as far as suggesting that in some way the pharmaceutical companies held these governments to ransom over the issue. Or maybe they just work in inclusion, I don't really know. Yeah, I asked them about this checklist, because the WHO checklist for influenza pandemic, preparedness planning, and you can go and look at this on their website. I thought I had the link on this slide, but I haven't, but that's the document reference. During a pandemic, it may be necessary to overrule existing legislation or individual human rights. Examples are the enforcement of quarantine, overruling individual freedom of movement, use of privately owned buildings for hospitals, off-licence use of drugs, compulsory vaccination, or implementation of the emergency shifts in essential services. These decisions need a legal framework to ensure transparent assessment and justification for the measures that are being considered, and to ensure coherence with international legislation. International health regulations, brackets. What are those? I asked the Department of Health, is Britain a signatory to this checklist, or is EU, UK or other legislation in place which would mean that this checklist can be applied to UK citizens? In other words, can they change the law and restrict your freedom in the circumstances of an outbreak of the so-called pandemic? And the Department of Health said the WHO document to which you refer is simply intended as guidance to assist member states in their flu pandemic planning. So they essentially said that it had no basis in enforceable law. So, I mean, that also brings me to another point. A lot of people were saying that they were going to have forced vaccination, forced quarantine and all this. I got an answer from the Department of Health, at least said in writing, that wasn't the case, that nobody had said that officially. Yeah, what I was finding though, and I've said this before over the 9/11, the alternative media have also helped to promulgate fear and misinformation. Look at this one. In fact, actually I'll go on to this one. Yeah, because these two slides are the wrong way around. Somebody sent me this from New York. I've got somebody in New York. They found this on their car windscreen. I think it was in New York, was it? Yeah, New York. This is a scare tactics in the alternative media as well as the mainstream media. Infowars.com. I mean, what's a terrible picture, isn't it? It's really scary. Mandatory vaccination has been talked about a lot in the alternative media, but I've not seen really any legislation, or I've heard of any instances of that really. Apparently there's been a few nurseries which have tried to get kids vaccinated in the States, not here as far as I'm aware. And also there's been one university which has asked for students to be vaccinated before they go into that university in America, but not here. So I think, I was going to play that other clip, but we're running on a bit, so I think we'll, yeah, just a quick summary. No compelling evidence for swine flu. They made vaccine deals in 2007, which is 2 years before the outbreak. Very suspicious of that. Accepted liabilities for the vaccines. Pharmaceutical companies have been involved with accidentally releasing contaminated materials, not properly tested, contains toxic substances, and it's just part of a larger set of engineered scams to scare and control the general population. That's just a swine flu summary, I think. Yeah, right, so we'll have a break there, because now we're going to go on to the good stuff. We've had the bad stuff, now the good stuff.
Health Canada says the best way to avoid the flu is vaccination, which in many provinces is free. Well, let's see if these recent flu shot recipients can help reveal the mystery of why Cheetos and Pop-Tarts list their ingredients while vaccines do their best not to. Are you aware of the ingredients in the vaccine?
I know there's some egg products.
I don't think they offered us a list of ingredients, though.
That, no, I don't know. This is blind faith for me. But did you know that there's mercury in that shot?
No, I didn't.
Oh, I did not, no. Are you glad that it's free?
Yes.
But you know it's not really free.
Yes.
Well, that's paying through our taxes, right? So, if I sneeze right now, would you be okay with that?
No.
Well, these people confirm two things. Some are happy to wait in line for a secret serum, and nobody likes getting sneezed on. But what if drug companies are right? What if tricking your body into thinking it's already sick doesn't make you sick? What if there's not enough vaccine to go around? You should know that making your own is easier than brewing your own beer. And it could save your life. Well, the first thing you need is a live virus. Now, is there anyone here suffering from the flu? Sir, would you favor us by discharging directly onto these chicken embryos?
I think I could do the hell.
Okay. We now have our chicken embryos and our live virus. Now, from the pickled frog jar, your local school's biology class, we'll keep that virus dead like the drug companies do with formaldehyde. Now, careful, don't get any frog in the mix. That'd be gross. Now, let's add a little ether. Careful, don't fall asleep. And then we dump some detergent in there. That keeps it clean. And remember when your mother lost her mind when you played with mercury because it never leaves your body? Well, that makes it a great preservative. If you have a thermometer, well, staying healthy is a lot more important than room temperature. Now, all of this goes into the centrifuge, like this blender, and hey, 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 it's vaccine for the whole family. Well, the debate over whether vaccines usually don't work or aren't fully safe may never end, which at least explains why the contents are rarely publicized.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm just
But it's government recommended. Oh well, that's my eye on the flu shot.